Hello, it's time for my week 2 update for Horror Mayhem. Again, Horror Mayhem is a BookTube event started by the Bookish Bryants, Scott and Becky Bryant, celebrating or meant to put a focus on short horror fiction, 250 pages or less, short novels of horror, novellas, novelettes, and short stories. So, this past week, I read some stories ranging from 1890 all the way up to 1980. I know that's still quite in the past, 45 years ago, but that's about as far forward I'm probably going to go for my horror reading this month. There were some gaps in between. I didn't do every single decade between those two. So let me run down the 10 horror stories that I read this past week. Some of them were just fantastic. Most of them were very good. And one was a little disappointing, which led me to reading a second one from that author. And that's the first author I'm going to start off with today. And that's author Machen. Now, I used to pronounce him mistakenly Machen, but apparently it's pronounced Machen. Arthur Machen was a Welsh writer of mystical and horror stories. And he's well known for writing The Great God Pan, and the novel of the White Powder, and the Bowman, also known as the Phantom Bowman, which was quite a notorious story about a ghosts of some old English bowmen that came to the aid of some soldiers during World War I believe. Anyway, I read first the short story by him from a ebook anthology, another one from the British Library Tales of the Weird collection. And this is a very good collection called Circles of Stones, Weird Tales of Pagan Sites and Ancient Rites. And that was edited by Katie Soar, who is herself I believe, an archaeologist. And the first Arthur Machen story I read was called The Ceremony. I would hesitate to even call it a story. It was more like a vignette, but it wasn't particularly satisfying for me. It's interesting and nicely written. Machen was a very good writer. Nice, beautiful prose. It's hard to kind of describe the story. It's basically the kind of reminiscence or musings from a point of view of a young woman, just a young girl becoming a woman. Maybe she's around 18 and she has some memories centered around a stone figure, a statue, an ancient statue in the grounds of where her estate where she lives. And she has some memory of being a baby, a young child, being taken out by the stone and something happening that later caused her nurse, her nanny, to cry into the night, related to something mysterious that never quite made clear. And then as she is turning 18, she witnesses another young woman go out and do some kind of rite in front of this statue, and then she later does something similar herself. What exactly this is, not spelled out. I'm guessing it's something of a sexual nature of some kind, tied to some kind of ancient pagan rite. It's not made clear. It's, I don't mind if a story's ending doesn't resolve or is a little vague, but this takes vagueness to a little too far of a degree for my taste. So I knew that Machen was, capable of much better. So this left me a little underwhelmed. So I wanted to give him another shot for this, this event, Horror Mayhem. So I found another story I had on hand here in Japan. Again, I have a collection of his most well-known horror stories, but of course I don't have it here. It's back in storage. But what I do have is one of his stories in my Weird Tales, kind of the magazine that never dies, one of the multitude of Weird Tales collections out there. This one's edited by Marvin Kay, a really terrific editor of these kinds of anthologies. And of course, Arthur Machen was, he might have still been around and writing when Weird Tales started, but this would be called a Weird Tales reprint. And it's The Lost Club. Okay. Now this story was much more satisfying. Not only is it twice as long as The Ceremony, but it's also much, much clearer. It again doesn't spell everything out, leaves some kind of haunting atmosphere left over to keep you thinking after the story's over without being spelled out the fate of a certain character. But it gives you plenty enough to feel satisfied, like you got something, a complete tale told. And basically what happens in the Lost Club, there's two young gadabouts, Victorian gentlemen about town. One is named Austin and the other is named Phillips. And they're tootling around out somewhere in the one of the suburbs of London, and they cross paths and they decide, hey, we're both members of the same club. Let's go break bread together. And they both are in town for some kind of unstated legal business that they don't really want to talk about. They have a little too much to drink during their meal, and they wander out into the street afterwards, kind of talking to each other and just aimlessly walking around the streets. And then a sudden storm, a really fierce rainstorm, breaks out, and the men who are dressed in the latest fashion and finery are getting soaked. And so they take refuge eventually in this little kind of a covered archway leading to a dimly lit, dark building. And then one of the men sees another person that he knows, another person in society named Mr. Williams, and says, hey, Williams, I heard that you have a club around here somewhere. We are caught out in the storm. Can we come in? And Williams first looks at them a little bit and he says, well, okay, I know you, both of you young gentlemen, you can come in, but you must promise me to never say a word about what you see or what happens in this club. And they're like, oh, of course, old chap. Oh, no problem. Yeah, we won't. Mum's the word. You can count on us. And so they come into this club and they immediately sense a tense atmosphere, an atmosphere of excitement and also apprehension and worry among all the various people gathered there, most of whom are very high positions in society, high-level bankers, aristocrats, ministers of parliament, etc., all kind of movers and shakers that are very familiar to these two young gentlemen, Austin and Phillips. And so they're wondering what the heck's going on. Why is there this weird atmosphere? And then an even more famous societal member, who they know the name of, comes out and says, okay, gentlemen, it's time to read the book. And whoever gets the black page must follow the rules of the club. And then what happens after that causes quite a bit of consternation and disturbance to the two young gentlemen who've been invited into this club. And let's just say that it's a rather sinister situation. Quite an interesting little story with a nice, not conspiracy exactly, but sinister overtones of something going on behind the scenes, a hidden club that moves around, hard to track down, and what happens to certain unlucky members once in a while that are unfortunate enough to get the black page, let's say. Very interesting story. So the Lost Club actually predates in publication order the ceremony. So the Lost Club was published in 1890 and the ceremony was published in 1894. And then we move into the 20th century and we return again to William Hope Hodgson. Now I talked about a Hodgson story in my week 1 update video for Horror Mayhem. And what can I say? I love Hodgson's short stories. I wanted to read some more. So I pulled out of now I don't have this one, I don't believe, here in a physical form. So I found it, along with many other interesting short stories, in a collection, another online collection. And this is kind of an unusual name, but this is Fantastic Stories Present the Weird Tales Super Pack, Volume 1. Now I bought Volume 1 and 2. Volume 2, the Super Pack Volume 2. This story and another Fritz Leiber story later, which I'll talk about soon, came from this edition. There's all sorts of these cool groupings of massive, large volumes of horror stories and science fiction stories and detective stories in various packs on ebook form. for a very affordable price. I think I paid around $2 for this Weird Tales Super Pack Volume 2, and same for Volume 1. So William Hope Hodgson, again, physical culture. He was a early stage bodybuilder, and he was a writer, and he had been a sailor. He was a very interesting man if you look into his background. And unfortunately, he lost his life in World War I. But who knows many more great stories he would have written. Now, this short story, The Terror in the Water Tank, was published in 1907. And it's very reminiscent of something that Arthur Conan Doyle might write or might have written. Both he and Doyle and Hodgson have kind of similar styles, fairly straightforward reportage sort of tales, usually from a point of view of a narrator relating some events that happened. In this case, the water tower, or the water tower is basically a water tower in question, is in this village area, and it's kind of a place where people go on a nice summer evening or spring evening after dinner, and they promenade around the walkway that's around this water tank to kind of get a view and get some nice cool breeze. And one night they find a body is found who's been strangled, money's been taken, and some jewelry from the man. And it turns out the man is a prominent local businessman, and he happens to be the father of the narrator of the story's fiancé, his fiancé's father, who dies. And so that brings the main character, the narrator, into the story. And, because of his connection, he's allowed on the scene a little bit. This is in the days of policemen maybe were a little more laissez-faire about who they allowed onto the scene. I don't know. But he starts talking to the pathologist, the local doctor, who's a little puzzled by what happened. He's not quite sure how the man was strangled. There's no footprints in any mud around anywhere that's kind of below the water tank. But there is some mud for some reason down below, like some water is slopped out of the overflow pipe. And all seems kind of mysterious. Then later, there's lots of looky-loos, as happens in this kind of situation. People come and kind of hover around the area, but so the police cordon it off. And then later, subsequent night, maybe the next night or a couple nights later, one of the policemen on guard is also killed, strangled. And they hear a brief struggle, but no one can see what's happening. And when they come up, they find him dead. This is causing great consternation, of course. And in the meantime, the doctor examines the body, but later he becomes ill. He goes away to recuperate. And for a couple months, he doesn't come back. Now, in the meantime, the narrator plays detective a little bit. He questions the kind of watchman, the caretaker of the water tank, and trying to get some blueprints or plans about the tank, because he's curious about if there's a place where someone could hide in the tank or whatever. And while the caretaker is looking for those plans, the narrator finds in a kind of urn in the watchman's house the money and jewelry belonging to the first victim. And he immediately calls the police in, and they arrest the caretaker. He's tried, and then he's charged with murder and sentenced to hang for the death of these two men. And unfortunately for him, the doctor recovers and comes back and talks to the narrator and says, "Oh my God, what have you done? There's an innocent man." He's not innocent of taking the money from the corpse, but obviously that's a lesser charge. He's guilty of that. But he's not guilty of murder. And the doctor won't say who is guilty of the murders, but he has a clear idea, and he tells the narrator and the local police inspector, "Come with me tonight, and I'll show you who did the killings." And what did the killings is not a human. Very fun, creative story, this one. And then after that, I moved up to 1912, and I read The Tarn of Sacrifice by Algernon Blackwood. Now, Blackwood, very famous writer in the annals of early horror stories, horror fiction. He really was particularly adept at getting into the mystical and kind of, He was into maybe a lot of myths and legends, reincarnation, druidic rituals, things of that nature. For this story, I went back to the Circles of Stone, Weird Tales of Pagan Sites and Ancient Rites, of course, because that's definitely what we got going on here. Not so much a particular stone circle, but certainly some ancient rites. So this story starts off with the narrator is about ready to embark on a kind of walking tour through some local mountains, I believe, somewhere in the north of England or in a more remote rural area of England, walking amongst the mountains and hills. And he's asking for some background information he's chatting to the innkeeper about this, and the innkeeper's telling him, that, oh yeah, there's this tarn up there, a tarn. The Tarn of the title, Tarn, means a small alpine lake, a mountain lake, kind of hidden amidst some rocks and things. And we call this the Bloody Tarn. Oh, why is it called the Bloody Tarn? Well, it apparently was a site of when the Romans were here centuries ago they were had invaded and colonized for a while the British Isles, and the local tribal pagan people. Blackwood doesn't name the original peoples. He just calls them the pagans or the tribal people. But obviously they're either Celts or Wheels or whatever the particular group was that were fighting and trying to push the Romans out of England and the territory. This was, of course, before there was an England. And anyway, there's a story that these local tribes people had grabbed some of the Romans, particularly a Roman priest and two young lovers, a man and a woman, and they had tossed them down the cliff into this tarn, into this lake, which is why it was called Bloody Tarn. And the innkeeper also tells our main character that recently there's a father and daughter that are kind of camping out up there by this tarn. Apparently they had both suffered some kind of accident in Edinburgh or some bigger city, and they were coming out to this tarn to kind of recuperate, and they kept to themselves. They're camped out there, father and daughter. And the narrator, or the hero, I should say, he doesn't really narrate, but we hear his thoughts. We read his thoughts as he goes through. He heads up into the mountains on his hike, and immediately once he gets up there and he's enjoying the setting, eating his lunch and looking out at the desolate hills and mountain rocks, and he feels a kind of strange feeling start to come over him. He starts reminiscing about when he was in the war and how he kind of reveled in killing and the knife going in and his bloodlust and all this. And he starts to feel even more savage than in his heart than he felt in the past. He's trying to be honest with himself, but some other kinds of thoughts are starting to invade in his mind. And things are starting to seem a little familiar to him. He continues walking up there, and then he sees the father and daughter that are living up there. He sees the young woman there, and he feels immediate connection, like, I know this woman. This is my woman. This woman is for me. And she comes up to him right away and grabs his hands and pulls him along. And he starts to kind of fall under the spell of what's going on there. And it's leading up to this kind of strange ritual where somehow he feels he is the reincarnation, or it's his spirit was this young man that, along with the priest, who is the father, and the young woman that he feels inexorably drawn towards, was the woman that were all cast into the tarn centuries before. And this kind of strange cosmic event, the mystical event, is about to reenact itself in a certain way. And will he be able to exert his own normal mental control to stop what's happening? Or is he going to be pulled right into some kind of violent end? It's an interesting story, nicely written, and kind of he has a good sense of reaching into the past and that kind of strange mystical hold that some of these remote places might instill in some people. Interesting story. Okay, next in the time chronology, I left the Kindle verse for a little bit to pull out my trusty Grafton edition of the H.P. Lovecraft Omnibus. This is volume 3, The Haunter of the Dark, and other stories. And again, this has some of his absolute best stories, H.P. Lovecraft. And this is probably the best and my favorite story that I read this past week, and that is Pickman's Model. Pickman's Model was published in 1927, and it's just a fabulously evocative story. Now, Pickman's Model is who was the model is what's the key point here, but it's narrated by a young man. I'm assuming a young man. This is set in Boston, and again, we're dealing in the times of clubs, clubbable gentlemen, American clubs in this case, and the narrator is talking to another person relating his experience with Pickman. Now, Pickman was this artist, and he was kind of slowly being shunned by the other club members because his art, his paintings were too hideous for public consumption according to the standards of the time. The paintings that got him shunned by a lot of his fellow club members weren't so bad, but they were pretty extreme. And only the narrator, who had a kind of, he made of sterner stuff. He experienced the war overseas. I'm assuming World War I. He'd seen his share of violence and dead bodies and such, so he wasn't easily squeamish. And he found the technique that Pickman used so good, so memorable, so fantastic, actually, so skilled, that he became, kind of enamored of his art and started to get to know Pickman. And as Pickman was getting more and more shunned by other club members, he kind of latched on to the narrator to kind of, hey, someone who's talking to me, I can share some of my thinking to this person. But of course, Pickman is not someone that normal people would want to know. And he invites the narrator to a kind of, not his studio. First, of course, he goes to his studio first, but the Pickman says, hey, I have some, if you're interested, I have some much more full-on extreme works which can't really be displayed even here in my studio. I have to have them in a secret place where prying eyes and the kind of looking down citizenry will not see it, right? They won't have a chance to be offended and castigate me for my work. And the narrator says, wow, yeah, I'm intrigued. Let's go. So Pickman leads him out to this old section of Boston with the gabled houses, or seem like they're from a previous century, and talk of all these tunnels that link between these old houses where ancient rites and hideous demonic rituals were held, and where the surface community had no idea the dark dealings that were going on. And Pickman starts to show him these paintings he has, and in every one they're a pack of, or singular, of these weird canine, half human, half doggish looking creatures, but really demonic and scary and evil looking, and they're often devouring corpses, including women and children. Anyway, in typical Lovecraft fashion, he's hinting at and circling around some really hideous, abhorrent, inhuman sort of monstrosities going on in behavior and look of these creatures. And then, of course, eventually Pickman takes the narrator down into the basement, the cellar of this old building where Pickman keeps his art, and this obviously where he does his art. He has a camera where he takes uses the camera to take backgrounds of cemeteries or parks or forests or other old dwellings. He uses for backgrounds in his paintings. And then the narrator, who's getting increasingly alarmed and horrified by the artworks that he sees, hears a strange sound like scraping. He sees there's a big well in this cellar, and it's covered by a heavy board cover, and he hears this kind of creeping sound and rustling sound. And then Pickman says, "Stay in this room," goes out with the gun. Several shots are fired. He hears some weird kind of squealing, unearthly sounds, and then Pickman comes back in and says, "Oh, the rats are getting a little bit too big for their britches and causing problems." But the narrator's not convinced it was a rat. And he kind of is ready to leave. "I've had enough. This is some crazy, scary shit." So he leaves, and Pickman escorts him back to the train, and they part their ways. And that's the last the narrator sees of Pickman, or anyone sees of Pickman. Very, very cool story. Now, the 1970s Rod Serling series Night Gallery did a couple of H.P. Lovecraft adaptations. Cool Air was one, and the other one was Pickman's Model. And it's pretty interesting. It replaces the narrator, a male narrator, with a female narrator who kind of gets involved romantically with Pickman. Bradford Dillman plays Pickman, and I believe Barbara Rush plays the art aficionado that gets involved with him. And they tried their best with the monster makeup for Pickman's Model. It's pretty interesting, but I can't touch, of course, the story. The impact of the story is really good, and it's wonderfully written, and I really enjoyed that story very much. It was one of Lovecraft stories I hadn't read yet. I was familiar with the TV adaptation, but not the story, and the book story is the one to go with. So highly recommend Pickman's Model. Well, holy crap, this is running on way too long. Sorry, folks. So I'm going to break this week 2 Horror Mayhem update into 2 parts. So this concludes the first part, where we're kind of working with some older stories, and I'm going to move up into the middle to later part of the 20th century in the second part, I hope, the way I break this up. So I'll see you in the next video, which I'll post probably the next day or so, and I'll think about doing this a different way. I think for week 3, maybe focusing on breaking things up in little smaller chunks so that you don't have to watch such a long video of me going blah, blah, blah for too long. Okay, so this ends the first part of the video. I'll see you back for part 2 in the next.